So Reagan's first public appearance was at Notre Dame, and it was a tradition for presidents going all the way back to Eisenhower, and in fact, all the way back to William Tecumseh Sherman and Ulysses S. Grant, that people coming out of certain victories would come speak at Notre Dame every odd year, especially every fourth year. And it kind of lines up with the presidential elections. There's kind of a neat history to that. But if you look back, Jimmy Carter's speech in 1977 was not an attractive speech. That's where he talked about the communists, basically, we have an inordinate fear of who and what they are, and that was at Notre Dame as well. So Reagan's going to answer that. So Reagan has barely survived this assassination attempt. He's come out of it probably much stronger and better than he was before. In fact, and I'm sorry I have all these little trivias about Reagan in my head, but Reagan actually worked out so much. He was 70 at the time he was shot. He worked out so much after he was shot that he put up 2 full additional inches of muscle on his chest between ages 70 and 72. The guy was stunning in every way. But before I start getting into weird territory, let me just say what Reagan said in 1981 at Notre Dame. So remember, he's speaking to the graduating class of 1981. So for you students, these are people your age. And he says to them, my brother at the time, we need you. We need your youth. We need your strength. We need your idealism to help us make right all that is wrong. Now, I know that at this period in your life, you have been and are critically looking at all the mores and customs of the past, and you're questioning their value. Every generation does this. May I suggest that you don't discard the time-tested values upon which our civilization was built simply because they're old. More importantly, don't let today's doom-criers and cynics, and again, I realize that you had to have been there, but in 1981, the idea that the Soviet Union would collapse or that America would recapture her former glory after the defeats in Vietnam and Cambodia were laughable for much of the public. Americans were truly dispirited in 1979 and 1980, especially after the Iranian hostage situation. A horrible moment to be an American, and yet Reagan saw past all of that. Most importantly, don't let today's doom-criers and cynics persuade you that the best is past, that from here it's all downhill. Each generation sees a little farther than the generation preceded it because it stands on the shoulders of that generation. And this is Reagan's greatest moment in his speech. And I still remember this, even though I was only 13. I remember this pause he made, and then he went into this. He said, the years are great ones for this country, for the cause of freedom and the spread of civilization. The West will no longer contain communism. It will transcend communism. Now you have to put that into context. Let me repeat that. The West will no longer contain communism. It will transcend communism. U.S. foreign policy, military policy, had been since 1945 under the containment strategy, 1946, under the containment strategy of Harry S. Truman, that whatever the Soviets did, we would counter them exactly. If they moved into one area, we would push them back to their border of 1946 and 47. If they built this number of missiles, we would build this number of missiles. Containment was based on the crazy idea of radical equality with the Soviet Union. Reagan is the first president, not Truman, not Eisenhower, not Kennedy, not Johnson, not Nixon, not Ford, and not Carter. Reagan is the very first president to understand you will never defeat the Soviets if it's only on material goals. It must be a spiritual battle. It has to be something greater. It has to be based on the definition and dignity of the human person. The West will no longer contain communism. It will transcend communism. It won't bother to dismiss it or denounce it. It will see it as a bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written. Now, I've had the chance to go through and look at not all, but many of the newspaper articles from the time, and almost nobody quotes this passage. Almost nobody. They focus on the first part of Reagan's speech, which was about football. They focus on other things. Nobody quotes this except for 2 papers, Pravda and TASS. They both knew it was the headline. Reagan thinks he's a medieval crusader, is what Tass said about Reagan. They got it right. And of course, they should have been quaking because Reagan just launched the first salvo against the Soviet Union. And it was not a missile. It was much, much greater than a missile. It was a threat to their very definition of the human being. And then Reagan continues. This is not where we would expect him to go. William Faulkner once said that man will not only endure, he will prevail against the modern world because man alone has the old verities and truths written on his heart. And then Faulkner also said of man, he is immortal because he alone among creatures has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. I love those three words. Compassion, sacrifice, and endurance. They're not quite as good as grace and truth, but they are really, really close. And when I think of conservatism, that's what I think of. I think of compassion, I think of sacrifice, and I think of endurance. When I think of Western civilization, yes, we've had our problems. We've had our racism. We've had our imperialism, sometimes horrible, sometimes genocidal. But we've almost always come back to right reason. And when we've come back to right reason, we have done so because somebody has pointed the way and reminded us of what is always true. Reagan continues. He says, one cannot think of those words, compassion, sacrifice, and endurance, without thinking of the irony that the one who so exemplifies them, Pope John Paul II, a man of peace and goodness, an inspiration to the entire world, would be struck by a bullet from a man towards whom he could only feel compassion and love. It was after John Paul II who warned us in last year's encyclical about how mercy and justice have been turned against certain people in the name of injustice, in the name to justify class struggle. President and I were talking about this at lunch today. Yeah, when we think about social justice warriors, they get two things right, justice and warrior. What they misunderstand is what true justice is. They misunderstand what it means, what the dignity of the human person is, and they start thinking in categories of race. They start thinking in categories of gender, and they cannot see the human person in front of them. They cannot see them. They are blind to the dignity of the human person. For the West and for America, Reagan said, the time has come to dare to show the world that our civilized ideas, our traditions, our values are not, like the ideologies and war machines of the totalitarian world, merely a facade of strength. It is time for the world to know that our intellectual and spiritual values are rooted in the source of all strength, a belief in a supreme being whose law is higher than our own. Now that's a commencement address. That is beautiful. That is what every commencement address should be like. But I want to end with this. Reagan got something absolutely right. And it wasn't just right in some kind of airy notion. It wasn't superficial, and it wasn't purely romantic. There were lots and lots and lots of people listening to Reagan. Most of them happened to be in Eastern Europe. And when they heard those words, they knew this is it. It doesn't matter if they revolt like they did in 53, or again in 56, or in 68, or 1979. This time it would mean something. This time they would have the backing of the West. And we now know that Reagan and John Paul II and Bill Casey, the head of the CIA, spent so much of the 1980s working to undermine the totalitarianisms of the East. And they succeeded. On November 9th of 1989, without a single shot being fired, thousands upon thousands of East Germans protested, and they brought down the Berlin Wall that night. I was a senior in college when that happened. Now, I just want you to think about that. I don't want to be too autobiographical, but I was a seventh grader when Reagan gave that speech. By the time I graduated college, the wall came down. Nobody would have expected that in my childhood, and I don't mean mine in particular, I mean that time period, nobody expected that the Soviet Union would be destroyed.